Nyali Banjalangi Rakol Jugun Nyali Gani Garama Mala Jugun.
So I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which Mullumbimby stands, the Bunjalang people, and to offer on behalf of everyone our deep respect and acknowledgement of the way they have known how to live on this land without harming it and without damaging it in any way, and acknowledge the wisdom that they have shared over so many centuries to keep this ancient land in harmony. So tonight we have two speakers, two amazing, powerful women who I'm in deep admiration of, both of them. And tonight's topic that's better right back there. Tonight's topic is our positive future in a post-neoliberal world. And it's clear to many people that neoliberalism and its obsession with the so-called free market is on its way out. But to be replaced by what exactly? How can we create a just, peaceful and sustainable world? And what would that look like? So tonight we have the Honourable Senator Rhiannon and Dr. Liz Elliot to discuss these questions for us. And first I'll just introduce Liz. Liz became aware of the world politics quite early on in her youthful years with the Vietnam War and with the destruction of the superb East Australian forests. And she began to question why money interests can abuse the delicate environment in this way. She worked as an emergency doctor in Mullumbimby Hospital for many years until it recently closed down and she retired. And she's been speaking, cartooning, and writing about sustainable economies for the last 20 years. And after years of activism and strongly opposing the multilateral agreement on investment and private money creation, she met Helen and Robert Hodge, who is here tonight. And she pioneered the localization movement and inspired Liz a lot. She's written 3 books, and her most recent one is called A New Way Now: How We Can Afford a Happier Future and Can't Afford Not to. And that is available tonight over on the table over here. So that's Liz. But I'll introduce Lee as well, I think, before we go on. Lee's got an amazing bio to her. She's been a senator for New South Wales since 2011, representing the Greens. And prior to that, she was a member of the New South Wales Legislative Council between 1999 and 2010. Rather like Liz, interestingly, in 1968, she and some friends formed High School Students Against the Vietnam War. So they were both obviously inspired by that war, so some good came out of it. In the 1980s, she helped organize a peace camp protest outside the joint US-Australian Defence Facility in Pine Gap. Very worthy cause, I'd say. She was a member of the Women's Advisory Council to New South Wales Government and the New South Wales Secretary of the Union of Australian Women, and founded the Coalition for Gun Control. So a lot of support for women there. In the 90s, she joined Greens and worked at the Rainforest Information Centre, campaigning against the logging of tropical trees. She also opposed the privatisation of public assets. In 1999, she was elected with more than 100,000 votes to the New South Wales Legislative Council for the Greens, joining our own Ian Cohen in the state's upper house. She was re-elected with more than 300,000 votes at the 2007 state election. And first of all, I'd like to welcome Liz to the stage to open the report.
thank you to the Indigenes who looked after this land for 100,000 years. We're all going to have to re-indigenise and find again our connection with the land we love so much, deeply, deeply. And there's many skills that we need to learn. So, yeah, it's great to be here, it's great to live here, and it's great to be part of Ngara and Richard and the team who do such wonderful work for us all. So, what am I talking about? Post-neoliberal future. I actually would like to say post-corporate rule. Neoliberal to me is a bit of an academic term. The good news, I suppose we should start with the good news. This is a wind of change blowing. When I see that 70+% of Britons now accept that water, rail and other facilities, particularly health, should be renationalised and more money given to education. Education should be free. They don't support the privatisation epidemic that's gone on for the last 50 years under the name of efficiency. So that's really exciting that Britons have grown up and seen that neoliberalism, corporate rule, is not working for the average Briton. And Jeremy Corbyn supports Marvellous, and of course Bernie Sanders. So, you know, Brexit, even Trump. So there's a new wind. Another interesting thing is that people are saying that millennials, the young workers, are fed up. They're sullenly conformist, but they're angry that they've been cut out of the housing and the job market, and they are interested in networking, not hierarchy. They are fed up. That's the old way. So I think the time's right for change, and the alternative is collapse. 3 kinds of collapse are available, all awful. One is ecological collapse. Of course, we've got climate change and resource shortage. Number 2 is financial collapse, which is likely. We're already starting to see a downturn in the housing market here. And that could unravel quite quickly like it did in 2008, because the fundamentals are just as bad, if not worse. So we have ecological collapse, financial collapse, and we have social collapse. And any of you who've got my little copy of the talk on the table might notice a little spelling error. I meant to say we've got a social collapse, which is the name of inequality. And as you know, 3 people now own more than half of Americans, and that is accelerating. You know, where does it end? Does it end up in Hitler, the one world ruler? Who knows? So I say that that is actually a mathematical certainty, because as long as money is privately created, we are going to have gross and increasing inequality. We all already have it compared to Africa, compared to Asia, and increasingly in our previously socialist, semi-socialist country. So inequality is rising to the point in Australia that we are one of the worst of the developed world in terms of the percentage of the GDP that goes to the workers. I think it's 46% now. So, yeah. So the bad news is we're headed for collapse, and most people intuit this, and they flip-flop between voting for the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, but maybe they'll vote for a fascist party instead, because it must be brown people's fault. So it's up to us to really say there is an alternative. Most people can't even see an alternative, but there is, and in a single word, the name is decentralisation. We've got a talented population with a wonderful internet and many other great inventions, water purification and energy, and we can make this world work, but we can't make it work if it's going to be increasing amount of powers to the top 1%. So I believe there's a wind of change. I believe we're in a very dangerous situation, but I believe there are alternatives, and that's what we're here to discuss. We have to have diverse forms of decentralisation. Obviously, a Mongolian herder isn't going to want the same thing as a downtown New Yorker. We're going to have 3 levels of governance, I believe. One's international, to keep the oceans, the air, and the peace. And they're going to have some, well, I won't go too far there, but it's one man, one vote, and yes, that means Chinese people will have more votes than Americans. Secondly, we will need national governments, mainly to protect us from predators. Predators, somebody says that means sharks. No, what I mean is financial predation, which is very enormous, and of course wars, which are an anachronism. And then lastly, we'll have localisation, and I hope the majority of decisions can be made on a local basis. As I say, we can have this is a long history. What people don't realise is that local control was the norm in most of Europe till about 600 or 700 years ago. And certainly it's still the case in Bali, those who know the Banjar system. It can work. It's worked many times, but unfortunately you've always got some king-like figure come in and say, oh, you know, you need my army and you need to send me taxes. We don't. We can keep the money in our area, we can keep the work, the accountability, and we can keep our industries within our own area. There's studies that show that if you go to a local shop and a chain, you're going to keep a lot more of the money in the town than you are if you'd shop at a chain store. So we have to support local economies. In fact, the basic way we're going to get any of this done is by supporting our local economies and re-regulating the large banks and corporations that are taking over our lives and even pushing for war. So there's a long tradition of democracy, of local control, and it's going to need a few things. One is it's going to need sophisticated meeting understanding. We've got people here from sociocracy, which is one way. Can you put your hand up? Yeah. So this is a way of anyone who wants to talk to someone about sociocracy, please come and see, because it's an amazing system where we can actually learn to listen to each other in rounds and interlocking rounds in each area at the factory level, at the local level, at the school level, at every level of government locally. It can be made more efficient. But I'm afraid that democracy takes time. So what I'd like to say, how much time have I got? Some timekeeping?
Another 5.
5. I've got 3 solutions, I suppose, things we need. One is time. One is more time, one is more money, and one is more land. So how are we going to get that? Well, I would posit that 60 to 70% of our current work, resources and emissions are complete waste of time. Completely nonsense, going up to the top 1% of the population, going on war and waste, and various forms of nonsense. So we could cut 60 to 70% of our work time out right there and have very little change in standard of living. And certainly we waste a lot and we overconsume in our desperation to feel needed and loved, which we could certainly replace with people who love you. So we can get more time, we can work less hours. We probably should be only working 2 or 3 days a week and sharing the work and sharing the leisure and caring more for each other and the environment, and yes, going to meetings. So we can get more time. Secondly, we need more money. Money at the moment, as you know, is mainly created by private banks. 97% of credit is credit, and it's created out of thin air, and they don't create the interest at the same time. So what does this mean? We're all running as hard as we can. We're pushing ourselves non-stop to try and trade the environment, trade our children, trade our time, trade our lives, everything to get a bit more money to try and pay the interest back. And the interest is often 2 or 3 times the original loan. So you've got a money system that is privatised, an enormous amount of power that is accruing to a very few percent of the population. And you've got it driving growth and all sorts of competition through the interest mechanism, which is false. So we can have public banks, we can have diverse money creation systems, including local currency, maybe cyber currency, I don't know. And certainly we can have peer-to-peer trading and love and lots of other forms of transactions that money has become to rule our lives, and maybe not in this room, but most of Australia are desperate for some more money. And the reason they're desperate for more money is often not only to pay interest, but to pay costs. Most people are earning quite well in Australia, those who are working, but they're working long hours and they're paying high costs. And that's why the Liberal Party's thing about electricity prices strikes a chord, because everyone knows rentier capitalism. That's when the capitalist gets a lot of money, buys a service, and just rents it back to you, like a road or a school or electricity or telecommunications. All of these services, which add up to 23% of our costs, rentier capitalist type costs. You could also say our privatisation costs. These are driving ordinary workers very, very hard, and it's very hard And the biggest costs, of course, are interest. And renting and housing, which is a national disaster, is largely driven by the bank system and the whole thing about interest. And that probably is 40 to 50% of our costs. So there already are probably accounted for 50, 70% of our work, emissions and resource use could be saved. We could all live much more relaxed, nice, happy lives and actually care for each other and the environment and go to meetings. So money can be liberated. It's not that difficult. There's lots of people can do it. We could do it tomorrow, actually. So it's just that there's a few forces who'd like to keep the money creation thing to themselves. And I won't go into names, but immediately we need a debit tax to slow the derivative trade. We need a hoarding tax, and that's a very radical idea to keep money moving instead of people piling up money into a big pile which then becomes a power that they can use against society. We can encourage people to move money on. And finally, we need a Glass-Steagall law tomorrow so we can avoid the next financial collapse, which is bearing down on us now. We have to separate investment banking from Ma and Pa type banking so that your mortgages and your homes are safe. So money needs liberating. It's not difficult, but it's all kept under the carpet because it's just too juicy for the 1%. And finally, we need more land. Well, I'm afraid they're not making any. So what are we going to do? Well, this is the bit that upsets white people because we love our land, we love to own our land, but we can't. So how are we going to do that in a gentle way? We don't want too much bloodshed, though I fear there may be some. I think over 33 years, at a 3 to 4% tax, land tax, people have the choice to either give it back every year in 3 or 4% of the value, and of course it's overvalued at the moment, or they can give it to the community. Eventually the community owns the land, and yes, you will need a few more meetings, but we need to control land so our children can have access to it. We need to control beautiful land so it's publicly accessible. Indigenes need to control their own land. Land value tax and cooperative land movement things are exceedingly important, and it's sort of an area nobody wants to discuss because it's painful, but it has to be discussed because they're not making any more land, and particularly beautiful, biodiverse and complex land. So in summary, we can all live better lives, we can live happier lives, we can live more connected lives, we can live localised lives. We need to work less, liberate our money system, liberate our land system, and I would like you to join me in a rousing chorus of, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one.
So now let's give a really warm Mullumbimby welcome to Senator Rhiannon.
I do acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay tribute to their history, their culture and their ongoing contributions to our community. Thanks very much for the invitation to be with you tonight. I've got to say really close, okay? I will make sure I do it. I really appreciate the invitation to be here with you tonight. Liz's talk was fantastic, and she made the point about the winds of change. And that's certainly the case across the world. There are social movements rising that the system isn't working and the change is needed. And just this week, and I thought it was relevant to share with you, I have actually 4 events on this week. This is the 3rd one. Tomorrow night I'm launching a book on neoliberalism, all about neoliberalism, the failure of capitalism, people talking about wanting to discuss it, which I think is very informative. Like, the objective conditions are with us in so many ways. These discussions are always relevant, but to explore what's wrong with the system, and as the talk for tonight has identified what the future will look like, I think is incredibly important. When I was thinking about tonight's talk, particularly what excited me was it was about talking about the future. And that means you can really get into the things that you're very passionate about and how the world should be. And I'm always one, it was the introductory remarks, used the word optimistic. And I have been optimistic in my life. I've been very fortunate, first in my family, to go to university. There's differences, hardships along the way, but life in Australia for many of us is pretty good. But there's so many people have been left behind and their lives have largely been destroyed by neoliberalism, by the state capitalism is at the moment. If they're going to consider what the future looks like, they've got to think of what's happened to them, who they are, what their situation is now, and what needs to change. And I think it's worth sharing that with you, what's happened what's going on right at the moment for many people. Tonight there will be more than 100,000 people across Australia who do not have a home to go to. There's 2.3 million people in housing stress. That means that they're one disaster away to being on the slippery slope, to being like those people. And I mean that their kids get sick, they lose their job, they get injured at work, something dramatic happens, then they can't pay the rent, can't pay the mortgage. Then believe it or not, there's 2.9 million people in Australia, that's 13%, a bit more than 13% of the population, live under the official poverty rate. That's the OECD poverty rate, and 730,000 of them are children. And then when it comes to looking for work, there's about 3 million people who are looking for work, and there's more than 1 million people who want to work less hours. So the contradictions in our society is extreme, and with regard to the hardship that people are going through, the safety nets that have been set up can't cope. They just can't meet the demand that they're under for accommodation, for counselling services, for legal advice. So I thought that that's very relevant for us to consider when, that were the thoughts that went through my mind, because I'm getting excited about thinking the type of world we can build, and I believe that is very real and a possibility. And there's so many people who become so marginalised, so disadvantaged, so left behind by the system we're in. And in terms of the change, we need to ensure that that change is for them as well, and for them in terms of building equality in this country, as we are in increasingly a very unequal country. So unfortunately I didn't have enough of them, but I've given out a booklet to many of you called Sold Off, Sold Out. And that deals largely with the massive amount of privatisation that just happened in New South Wales. And that's where I'd like to start in envisaging the future. Is this massive privatisation has really been to the disadvantage of the majority of people and marginalised more people. Why those figures that I've just shared with you at the beginning of the talk are so shocking is because of privatisation, one of the main aims of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism's all about everything should be in the marketplace. Why do we want markets? Because that's how the corporate world makes money. So what's the job of the Liberals and Nationals, and sadly at times Labor have fallen into this? Well, you turn everything into a market. If it's the Land Titles Office, if it's the prison, you name it, if it's a public asset, public service, you turn it into something where companies can make money out of. And that does leave people behind, because you're only going to be able to make money out of it if you cherry pick those areas of return of profit. So I just wanted to go through with you those areas with regard to renationalising. Now this hasn't been on the agenda very much in New South Wales. It has started to happen in Victoria, where they've renationalised the railways after disaster privatising. But we really do need to now start looking to those areas that have been hard hit. And I'd say at the top of the agenda would be the electricity industry. Considering the urgency of climate change, within the Greens we've been talking about this extensively, that does need to be a real standout. A standout because that's the way to ensure that we have regular, we've got regular power delivery. It's a way to manage the prices, and it's certainly the way to ensure that we have as smooth as transition as possible to renewable energy that looks out for the workers, so people aren't just thrown onto the scrap heap, as is happening as coal mines are closing down. So although they're still opening up some, and we're hearing about Adani every day, if you go into the Hunter Valley, there are coal mines that are closing down. And having been, I've worked on this for over about 15 years, we've been regularly abused. We don't care about the workers and we'll put them out of a job. But seriously, It's the industry and its governments who do not plan to restructure these industries that are the ones that are so ruthless. So that really is an area that we need to give top attention to. And I'd also argue in the sense that in a world that is so security conscious, surely an area like electricity needs to be in public hands. So that's a top one. If you want to read more about that, John Quiggin, a professor from one of the Queensland universities, has done some fantastic work in this and has set out very clearly the need for a statutory authority with its primary mission is to deliver energy at low cost, and really details how that can occur. So some fantastic work is occurring in this area. On my list for renationalising, I would put right up there, just about with the electricity industry, is TAFE. Can I tell you what has happened at TAFE? What has happened at TAFE across this country is scandalous. We are putting at risk not just the education future of individuals, and obviously particularly young people, but the education and training standards in this country. And why has that happened? And tragically, this is where Labor really stuffed up badly. It was when Julia Gillard was the Education Minister. It's 2012. They come up with a new agreement on TAFE, new national agreement. And what's in that? It has to be a contestability model that allows for-profit providers to come in. That's how all those scandals came about. And seriously, there's been providers who didn't even have an office, didn't even have somewhere where the students would go. It was the easiest way to get money. Now, I need to talk about the future, so I won't go on about it, but seriously, we need to ensure that is a top priority, is to get rid of that part of it. The Greens' position is that we should have no for-profit providers, that we only have private providers only come into the picture if the public TAFE system can't undertake the work. We also need to be looking at the transport system. There's not sufficient public transport across the state. But if you look at Sydney at the moment, so much of what the money's being poured into a private transport system is robbing our regions, and yours is a standout because once you had a rail line, the Casino to Mullumbimby rail line, that should have been expanded, upgraded, had various spurs off it, and have connected up with the line coming down in Queensland. I mean, that is what a responsible government should do, and we need to keep that on the agenda, because a growth area like the northern New South Wales, where we are now, desperately needs public transport. Otherwise, you're going to end up like the congestion. I've often experienced it here myself. The congestion in Sydney is now killing parts of Sydney. And I use that word most decisively because of how it's playing out. So this renationalising all those areas that have suffered is a key way to drive a change in our society. Now, I've used the word neoliberalism, and I mentioned at the start that there's been 4 events on this week where this has come up. The first one was at our national conference, and that was about an hour and a half, just about that the system isn't working, what do we do about it? Last night we had a session on privatisation and nationalisation, a little bit similar tonight, and tomorrow night there's a book being launched on neoliberalism. So that's all excellent. But within that, what's continually coming up is that the system isn't working in terms of environmental protection, in terms of the economy, in terms of democracy, in terms of civil society, and I will go into those different areas. But with regard to what we're advocating, just in summary, because there's been a little bit of, and some people have asked me about it tonight, and I'm happy to take questions on it. It's in saying that the system has failed doesn't mean that I'm advocating for some centralised socialist system. But more and more, people are saying, if you look at so many different areas, we've heard from Liz, really nailed it in her talk. You've got experience in so many of your areas locally, what we see nationally, what we see globally. The environment is suffering, inequality is becoming wider. So we do need that debate around how society should change. So just to share with you some thoughts on that. I think a really standout area that we need to really challenge is housing. What's happened in this country with housing is really criminal. Public housing has been smashed, and what has happened? What has happened is that housing has effectively become another form of money. It's deeply shocking. We particularly hear about how young people may be in a situation where their life isn't as good as their parents. For the first time, this generation will go backwards. But when it comes to housing, it's not just young people who are copying it. There's many older people, and particularly older women, often after they've separated, suddenly find that they are just out of the housing market. They can't get into it. Now that's deeply wrong. In a society as rich as ours, it should not be allowed to occur. That where so often, for many young people, it depends on how much money their parents have got, if they can afford to get into the housing market. Now Australia is one of the worst countries in terms of how housing plays out. Much of Europe, it's quite different, and there is a model that we can really develop there quite extensively. But first off, we do need to get rid of the unfair tax breaks, negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts. They're there to make people richer. That's what it's all about. That's why I use the term housing's become a form of money, of how people can get rich. We need to recognise that housing is seen as a human right. It's set out as a human right. We need to talk about universal housing and homes for all. What the Greens are advocating is for a federal housing trust that would ensure people have got a home to start buying, so they can get a loan from the housing trust or rent. So they're given assistance according to what their needs are, and they pay it back according to what they afford. Now, making that statement in Australia today might sound pie in the sky and idealistic, but believe me, it's not. Some of you would remember that after the Second World War, we had Commonwealth state housing agreements that aren't that different from what I'm talking about, where people were given loans, low interest loans, so they could pay over a long term. So they had security in their home. We need to bring back certainty that people's home is where they can live, they can bring up their family, and then they're not at risk of suddenly being out. Much of Europe does not have the system we do. And I'm not talking about totally getting rid of the private housing market, but that we bring dignity and respect back to public housing, to social housing, and that a trust is something that they have similar bodies in places like Germany. They have a system in so much of Europe where many people rent. They don't rent because they can't afford a house. They rent because they have security in renting, that they're not going to be thrown out of their home. There is nothing wrong with renting if you can afford it and you have security. In Norway, the only person who can break a lease is the tenant, not the landowner. It is loaded in favour of the tenant, and we need to reassess our rental arrangements also so people have security. So housing is a big one in terms of ensuring that our society does become fairer. And I'm always hesitant to put something out of health, education, housing, those basic public services, what's most important. But I've got to say, since I've had this portfolio, I've really come to see that if people have a home, the security and the certainty, where the kids can study at night, they know where they are going, they're not couch surfing, they're not living out of a car, their health is better, their future prospects are better. Because there are so many studies now that if children are born into poverty, it's very hard for them to get out of it. And those figures that I gave you earlier, I think I might have forgotten to mention, that of the people living in poverty, the 2.9 million, 730,000 of them are children. That is Australia today. Many of us don't see that side of Australia, but it's real. It's particularly Indigenous people, it's particularly newly arrived people, but there are also many older Australians who are in those figures, and it's deeply shocking. I also wanted to deal with issues about how we change, because to get to the vision that Liz and I are talking about, and there's obviously many aspects that I haven't got into with health and education, and how we live together and the great creativity potential that can be reached in building harmonious communities and a more peaceful world. To achieve that, you need the drivers for social change. Another thing that's extremely damaging in our society today, particularly driven by the Turnbull government, is the attacks on the union movement. And this is very, very relevant when we're talking about change. The union movement may be much smaller in numbers these days than it was when many of us were growing up, but it is still the largest force, progressive force in Australia that is working in a collective, organised way for social change. It is still the largest force. I think we often lose sight of that. And when the union movement is smashed and restricted by so many compliance laws, because that's largely what's going on at the moment coming out of the federal government, when they're restricted and they're being told about, and the accusations are made that they're breaking the law and all those sorts of things, the restrictions are on, the heavy fines come in, they try and jail people, that also has a flow on to civil society. And it reduces our ability to organise, to agitate for change, and to get the urgent conversations going around these points. When I started the talk in terms of the future, I emphasised renationalising, because in many ways I feel that that is a starting point to wind back the clock, with regard to neoliberalism. And working with the union movement, working with communities will be central to that. But right now, under this Turnbull government, the attacks on the union movement are stepping up. They're stepping up in ways that we saw recently with that raid on the union, the Australian Workers' Union. We have more legislation coming through the Senate on attacks on the union movement than we've had in years. Now, in one way, it's not uncommon. The history of coalition governments is a history that when they come into power, they have their anti-union legislation. Under the Menzies government, you had it with the penal powers. With regard to the Howard government, you had work choices. And then under this government, we've had the Australian Building and Construction Commission, a Royal Commission, the registered organisations, and a raft of other legislation that is tying up unions in compliance. Compliance that's just about impossible, so then you can get the likes of Minister Michaela Cash get up and just in her shocking, shrieking voice talk about how that they're breaking the law. They're breaking, like some laws have to be broken. These are laws that are deliberately designed to tie unions up to a degree of compliance that it is really impossible for them to even do their organising around wages and conditions, let alone take on a lot of the political work that we know can be so important when you consider their role in fighting the Vietnam War, fighting anti-apartheid, and they did do some fantastic work in marriage equality campaign recently that's barely been acknowledged, but it is much harder for them to do that. And for taking green bans, the green ban movement, which is still there, and we got one on the Bondi Pavilion just recently, which helped win that and stop that privatisation. But if you listen to the unions, when they talk about that, when they did the green bans back in the 1970s, they weren't fined, they weren't jailed, they weren't threatened with that, because the laws at that time allowed those strike actions. They had the right to strike. And I do believe for the progressive movement to raise our voice, to have a vision for a post-liberal future, we also need to be supporting unions to have the right to strike, the right to entry. The right to entry onto buildings, right to enter workplaces so that they can check up and engage with the workers to organise them. Because remember, one of the such damaging aspects of neoliberalism is just seeing society as a bunch of individuals. And that's what the union movement is, the opposite of that, because it's about collective action. But it's not just the union movement that is under attack under this government. At the moment, there's enormous undermining of civil society in terms of environment groups, community groups in general, organisations like Get Up. And how the government's coming at that one, the Turnbull government, is to try and limit their funding. You'll hear shortly talk about bans on foreign donations, donations coming from overseas. Now, that's an area that we've done a lot of work in New South Wales. We had success in the New South Wales Parliament. We were able to get reforms on political donations because you would well know the history of the corrupting influence they have. But what the federal government has now done is that they won't bring in the laws about limiting all that other money. That's not me. They won't bring in the laws about limiting the money from the developers, the finance sectors, the mining industry. They're going after the foreign donations. It's a bit of xenophobic, a bit of dog whistling, doing the usual scare tactics about money, anything from overseas. But what they're now trying to do is not just limit that ban on the money coming to political parties, but bring in a change in the laws that would limit money, not just during election campaigns, but at all times going to the likes of some of the fantastic groups that are running the Adani campaign, the Get Up, environment groups in general, community groups, by limiting that they can't take money from anywhere overseas, even if it's well outside an election cycle. Now that is about just tying them up and really just about destroying their attempts to organise. Because in this era of globalisation, there's some bad aspects to globalisation, but there's also some people who realise in terms of campaigns to protect the environment, to work with communities that are being done over, that there's funders from different countries that are willing to share their money, and that should be, considering we don't use the corporate money, that should be allowed, and it's an area we need to watch. What they're also doing, the federal government is doing, is looking to take away the charity status of various groups. So again, they won't qualify for tax deductions. Now that means that will result also in a huge loss of money. And believe it or not, with regard to environment groups, a big issue is you can't be an advocacy group. And what they might try and bring in is that you have to spend 80% of your time planting trees, which we obviously want to do, but then we do need advocacy groups. We do need those groups that are out there campaigning for the change that we're talking about tonight, to safeguard us from the bad things government do, to have the vision for the future. And that's where this government is out to really tie that in knots and limit it. So I again wanted to give emphasis to that, because when we're considering the future, we need to consider how we will get there, and that's a big one to take on. When we're talking about unions, we're obviously talking about work. And I think in all aspects of the vision that we have for the future, we need to consider how this is going to play out for people's work. Because, as I mentioned, with regard to the energy sector, it's an area where people are losing many jobs, and we need to work out what that transition looks like. This issue could become even much more profound because of automation. I imagine that you've read many of the reports of possible millions of people losing their jobs. Now that's if automation goes in the wrong direction, but in terms of a post-neoliberal future, automation could be really wonderful for us, where so much of the tedious work can be done automatically, we can share work more fairly, have a shorter working week, and to ensure that those people who are able to work and wish to work have work available, and that there is a fair wage for all. Now there'd be questions how we tackle, but there's some really interesting work going on at the moment with the universal basic income or guaranteed minimum income. And there's experiments going on at the moment, an interesting one in Finland and the United States, to see how this could work. So rather than people being put on a very low amount of money if they're on the youth allowance or unemployment benefits, that everyone will get the same amount of money, and then there's various tax requirements if the money gets high. It has an advantage that it takes away the stigma, takes away a whole lot of the paperwork, and as I said, in some of the European countries it's already been brought in. In the United States, it hasn't been announced which of the states it will be tested in, but there's researchers. They plan to distribute grants to 3,000 people with below average incomes in 2 states, and will hand out $1,000 a month to 1,000 people's no strings attached, and half as much to the rest, and make comparisons on how they use the money. Now, there's increasing belief that this is a fairer way to manage people's income, because however the future goes, and I would hope that we do have a future where automation is used not to drive a divide in society, but to share the work equally, have a shorter working week, as I mentioned. To achieve that will be very tough, but there'll clearly be periods, even if we have that fantastic future, that there'll be periods when people are out of work. So something like this guaranteed minimum income is very important. One thought that has also been given to it is that it would have a consumer benefit too. And I'm not talking about overconsumption, but just people being able to ensure that they have a means to live by, and that's more than just being very basic and under the poverty line. Because at the moment, one of the worries that even the capitalist class have, if automation plays out as being predicted, that there may just not be people with an income to be able to buy goods, and that they've got a big problem on their hands. So I think that this is why all this is being given much more attention. It's also seen it will give, by having this guaranteed minimum income, it has different names, I'll call it for that for now, that it'd be possible for people to focus on more creative work, more community work, and hopefully get more satisfaction in how they fit in and how their work plays out. I also wanted to deal with the issue of the environment, because we've done so much damage to the environment that a post-neoliberal future really does need to ensure that environmental protection is not only a top priority, but that protection needs to be extended to a massive change in the waste products that are going into our environment, because at the moment our soil, our water, our air is being poisoned. There's now a new term being used, that this is the first geological era where it's human habitation is what is the main force on all the cycles, the earth cycles, the water cycles, the mineral cycles that make up the geological record of this planet. So we're at an extraordinary time where we need that extra protection. And I do congratulate the people of the Northern Rivers. I can tell you've given inspiration, not just your region, not just the country, but globally, with a fantastic campaign around coal seam gas. I like that, yeah, absolutely. A huge shout out. But we also need to take on, really, to ensure that a post-neoliberal future is one where we are also repairing the world, is to look at stop using the fertilisers and the pesticides and the chemicals we do now, as we are now. Like, the level of poisoning is so extreme in the world, because while it might give us greater fertility in the short term, in the long run, we are killing our soil and causing so much damage. Obviously, there's a land clearing issue that we need to stop. But I particularly wanted to give emphasis to water. There is growing concern that the wars in the future will be over water. And I saw this myself. I've been to Palestine twice. And it's easier to go in from Jordan. For most people, I went in from Jordan. You cross the Jordan River. The Jordan River, I must admit, I don't know heaps about religion, but I knew enough that you've heard about Jordan River when you grow up as a little girl. Jordan River is dry in many places because Israel takes 80% of the water of the Jordan River. And so for the Bedouin tribes, for the Palestinians, they don't have access to that water. And so then the aquifers of Gaza have now been broken. When I was there, the salt water, you could taste the salt water in the shower. It was so, like it's just, and I was able to drink fresh water. The people there can't. There's a high rate of kidney stones. So this issue of our water resources and how we restore the health of the planet is something that needs to be given every consideration. But to end on a positive note, I wanted to also speak about that I find that human beings, obviously, we're very different, and at times there's battles, at times there are differences in different ways. But I'm one that believes that most people have a caring component to them. And that's what we can foster in a future world where we learn that neoliberalism and how capitalism has worked has been a disaster because it's based on exploitation. It's exploitation because capitalism is about making more profits. And again, I'm not ruling out profits, but when it comes to all those essential public services, they need to be in public hands. But let's focus on, as individuals, that the values that I think the majority of people do hold dearly and we can foster and develop, that largely did get lost under neoliberalism. So to just go through some of them. Under neoliberalism, it's so much been about individual self-interest. I think what the community wants and what we can foster is a common good. Neoliberalism about competition. We would want to promote collaboration. There's the issue of growth. I know that's a sticking one, and it came up in some of the conversations I had just over dinner. Like, do we support economic growth? My answer to that is I'm not against growth, but it's growth who it's for and who it benefits and who controls it. So I think when I'm asked it in just a direct way, I always give the answer that it's about sustainability. Because within sustainability there's growth, but it is growth that can be sustained for human species and for our planet. And I think there's the one that it's often given to me about maximising wealth, and we should be maximising well-being. And there's so many of those aspects of neoliberalism that I think it's worth dissecting and recognising that there's other ways that we can do it. Because I think this personal dimension is very important to us. It does worry me that the way I'm 66, and I've seen society work in a much more collective way. It does concern me the degree of individualism that now dominates how our society works. But I think that there is a desire of human beings to work in a collective way. They can see the joy that comes from it, the benefits. The collective mind is quite extraordinary. When often you're in that discussion, you don't know who actually came up with the idea. It's just about that we got together and we worked together on something that's very positive. So I think it's about getting back to an affirming narrative about what the future can be. Yes, there's these huge challenges, but how can we work together? And I do think the state has a role to play in this transition to a more life-affirming society. I think the free education, free health needs to be an absolute hallmark of that. If we are going to deal with inequality, we need to ensure that that is, they are top priorities. And what flows on from that is the employment opportunities. I forgot to mention it earlier when I was talking about the shocking state of Australia, that one of the things that people are on welfare, they're told to go and find a job. The jobs aren't there. They're not there, and the indignity that is put on people, forcing them to go to these job interviews where they just knock back, knock back, knock back. When I left school, I was able to walk into a job immediately. I was in the 1970s, there was no problem at all. But talking to young kids, and then some of them just get off the benefits because they just are not interested in being put through it. It's so humiliating, and it's something that we need to take on. So my vision for a post-neoliberal world, it really isn't just an idealistic dream. I spoke about the housing, and I know some people, they don't roll their eyes, but they think, wow, that's just not possible in Australia today. But it is possible. And I think it's imperative, if we as people are going to survive and thrive on the planet, that we have a vision, but we're also practical how we achieve it, and we work together collectively for it. What's more, it is not simply for the future, because it's already starting to happen, as people of thought and goodwill everywhere are beginning the process of reassessing and realigning our personal, community and national and international goals. I do remain optimistic and I look forward to the questions and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Let's have Liz back on the stage as well. And if you'd both like to take a seat, and Sally can come and go around, and if any of you have any questions, you'd like to raise your hands.
I started off by saying I'll be at 4 events this week where this has been talked about. And it's been talked about that the system is failing, but we don't even have language about what we see as naming what the future should be. I think that's partly because under the Cold War and all the attacks, people don't want to use the word socialism. I'm not suggesting we should. But there's a hesitancy, I think, of how we name it. So I think that's one problem. But I think you've just got to forge ahead in many ways. And I think the issue around nationalising industries that have been privatised is a good one for my mind, because people get it. They can see that people are losing out with regard to electricity, with regard to TAFE. And then you can have those conversations about the sort of society we should be. So I don't feel I've given a satisfactory answer to your question. I am thinking about it, we're discussing within the Greens, but I think we need to be able to answer it. But I would value other people's views, and I'm sure Liz will give it a good go.
Depression in young English women is now 30% or more of women under 25, and serious eating disorders. And there's a great deal of depression and sadness and anxiety at all levels of our society, because it's basically a competitive society, and I don't think people prosper under those terms. They don't prosper under Stalinist centralist states either, and that's always how socialism is drawn. But increasingly more, and a majority of young Americans now say that they would like socialism or anything but this. Lee mentioned privatisation. I know it stinks for most people, and in particular I would emphasise the banks, and Bob Catter, God bless him, and many other people in Australia are talking about having a public banking again, and I think it's crucial, it's easily done, and it's going to liberate a lot of money for good. It's going to liberate a lot of money for good things like housing, like environmental repair, like education, and it can be done, and it's not difficult, so let's do it. It also will mean taking away the power from the Big Four and also the investment banks that Mr Turnbull, did we mention him? Do you know what he's going to do? He's going to give us tax cuts and more for the rich and more GST. That's what he flagged yesterday in Canberra. So we're headed for a situation where the 1% are so ridiculously greedy that I think it is offensive to most people. So we have to talk about values, and I think fairness and water are the two great Australian values. Is water a value? I think so. So sharing the water, clean water, and being fair is still fundamental to our way of thinking, and all over the world too. So I think when we talk with values, and those campaigns that they've run for Corbyn and Sanders, and the Get Up does it too, where you ring people up or you go to their home, 100 million people's homes were knocked in the Sanders campaign, and you say, what are you interested in? And they say, oh, I'm only interested in horses and gambling, or I'm only interested in getting rid of politicians, or whatever they say. You can talk with people and find out that actually horses are not going to do very well under neoliberalism or any stamp collecting or anything. But the point is, you can talk with people if you talk about their values, because most people value water, their children's future, fairness and so forth. So I think it's possible from the I society that we've created to become a we society, and I think young people are onto it. When I talk to my son-in-law, who's not what you call academic, he just says, we've been ripped off. And when you go to young people's parties, they understand there's a corporate pressure that is sucking up their future wealth and putting their very lives at risk.
Can you hear me? Yes. When you're talking about the future, the issue of population policy did not get a mention by either of you. I was just wondering whether you think that population policy is not connected to the future, or it is not worthy of debate?
Absolutely worthy of debate. It's the elephant in the room. I'm sorry I didn't have time in 10 minutes to cover all of humanity and all of time, but I tried. So, but population, people think it's a lost cause. It isn't. It is true that Africa is reproducing at a very fast rate, and it is time we actually gave Africa a little hand after so much colonialism. But in general, the world population is dropping. The rate of babies is down to 2.7 per woman, and it's continuing to go down. I think it is possible that we can stabilise before 2050 at 9 billion people, and it's a wonderful thing if women's education and health are encouraged. Obviously that will reduce the number of babies that are home. But what will really reduce the number of babies that we have is if people know they've got a secure future with housing and shared work and leisure. I think a lot of population rising is due to either male chauvinism or anxiety about the future. And I think when we've got societies that are more stable and caring, I think the birth rate will naturally drop. But it is a very important question, and we need to talk about it a great more. In fact, I saw this amazing graph, and it was what you can do for the environment. And there was like ride a bike and eat vegetables and, whatever, all sorts of good things you could do. But the biggest thing you could do by a huge amount was have less children, and particularly white pampered children. So population is big, and it raises a lot of issues of fairness, and I do believe it is going to stabilise, and I could talk for hours on population.
I think what we also need to bring in the issue about population is consumption, because like a family with 2 kids in Australia are consuming a lot more than a family of 12 in Bangladesh. And the inequality in the world is really reflected in this. What you see with population is that many countries in Europe have now got negative, their population isn't growing because of, they're not having more than 2 kids per family. And where you see the shift come is when women have access to sexual and health reproductive measures, where they have a job, where they've got education. That's what changes, and that's what, and I didn't unfortunately deal with it, but it's not just the inequality in Australia, it's the inequality with low-income countries, and that's getting much worse. Over the last 50 years, since the end of the Second World War, it's become extreme, it's scandalous. And if we address that, we actually are addressing population. The challenge one has, that when people then become more educated, is to ensure that they don't move into the excessively consumerist type of society that we have. And I think that that's in many ways even a more challenging conversation and changes that we need to address.
Hi, I've been asked to stand to raise the bar, so to speak, and I'm a millennial, and my question is, how do you see technologies in the future like artificial intelligence and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in the government? Are they talking about how that will destabilize the system and the status quo of neoliberalism? Is it offering an alternative? And universal basic income, do you see that that's a viable solution to these sort of unpredictable futures?
I think there's some wonderful new technologies. It depends who controls them. Unfortunately, a lot of them are just other centralising things and distracting too. We have a lot of pornography on the internet, and we have a lot of misuse of all sorts of technologies like war. So it can be great, depends who controls it, and once again it's a governance question, and that's why we're talking about how to structure our societies so that these very scary things like artificial intelligence can be used for the good and not the bad.
I find it interesting that the strikes are already occurring with Uber. There's a dissatisfaction with Airbnb. There's a huge advantage for some people, and then there's also disquiet. So we can't stop it, but again I think Liz's word is the critical one, is who controls it and who benefits. And again that comes back to the heart to my mind of what we're dealing with tonight, because in analysing the future, if the future is going to change, you need to be discussing changing who actually runs the show.
I'd just like to particularly mention the derivative trade, the shadow banking system, which is a product largely of the IT boom, because these people can trade, tiny fractions in a very few seconds, is it's like 50 times the world GDP, or at least 10. It's an enormous amount of money, and it's incredibly destabilising. This money rushes from country to country, can unseat governments and all our best laid plans to help the environment. So technology can be great, but as long as it's being used to get this money in the corner of the 1%, it's a bit frightening. I personally am a result of the technology of oral contraception. Our generation had some amazing technologies come in, like really good music, really good contraception, really great things came in. So it can be fabulous. Liberating, that's right. But at the moment, I'm afraid a lot of it is being used by people like the Koch brothers and other Republican type characters who are just trying to end the social contracts and make sure that young people have almost no chance, or as they say, they're kicking away the ladder.
I'd like to address my question to Lee. We owe an enormous debt to future generations when you think of what we've garnered, what we have acquired, what we've taken, what neoliberalism has done with our value system. So I now turn to education. Our youth, even as they're being educated, have to pay back a huge debt to a neoliberal government, shall we say, or to policies. And I'm wondering, is it possible for politicians to create a stance where that is eliminated so they are freed and given a choice in their life? Or will that, do you think, come from a direct action from students? I say this merely because my generation had the advantage of a Whitlam education, and that made a huge difference to our lives, not having debt. I look at my grandson in enormous debt, and I cannot see how we can envision a future for our young people if we keep them locked up forever in this endless cycle of poverty as a student, poverty with housing, poverty with an education, and then getting a degree, and poverty paying it all back. It's cruel. Can this happen from the macro, Lee, from questions to bring this policy in, or should we activate the young students?
Look, I think, great question. It's something I didn't deal with strongly when I spoke, but history teaches us that progressive change is from social movements. Like in many ways I'm an accidental politician. When I'm young, Parliament was where you went to protest, and I enjoy the work enormously. But seriously, every day that you are there, or when I went in, and every day that I'm there, you are reinforced with, if there's a strong public outcry about something, the politicians will take notice. The fact that I'm sitting here as a female politician is because our forebears literally rattled the chains. It's not because a male politician went to work in the British Parliament and thought, or the Australian Parliament, and thought, we'll give women the right to vote. It was because they were out there protesting against those horse races in London, that they were chaining themselves outside Parliament. How did we save the Franklin River? Because of the protest. When we saved the Franklin River, there wasn't one Greens MP in Parliament. Marriage equality, fantastic example. Marriage equality would not be on the agenda if there was not that huge social movement that arose. And I don't want to take anything away from the Greens, because we've been taking that up in Parliament for 10, 15 years, but we would have still been just a voice if there was not social movements. So coming to higher education, the Greens have been talking about it for a long time. The good news that I can share with you is that I find that there's not cynicism when we talk about free higher education. I had that portfolio for a while, and initially, when I had it about 5 years ago, I could tell people thought it was a bit of a joke, not possible, how can you have free higher education, it's ridiculous, costs too much. Now, it's recognised that that's what we should do. We are a rich country, we can afford it. building up, working with the unions, working with the student movement is absolutely critical here. And again, if we don't do it, Australia will lose out, not just in terms of the education standards, the individuals losing out, but also economically. Germany now has free higher education. They've brought it in every state. Chile, many other European countries, not just because somebody's got the sense this is the best in terms of education, they see it in economic terms. This is good for the whole country, and Australia really does need to get behind that and change.
Particularly Liz points about TAFE and trade education. That's really important. I'm not sure that everybody should be shoveled through a university to learn this academic stuff, but I do think people need a choice and it needs to be free. And Jeremy Corbyn's number one popular point was free education. So the young coming up now are agreeing with that, and my point is that we can afford it, because most of what we're doing now in resources, work and emission is just trash. It's just squandered. It's waste, and it's destroying our planet and our sanity. So yes to education, but I think education could be improved. I think it could be more local. I think it could be more relevant to third world people. I think it could be less academic. I think it could be more about all sorts of things besides books, and I think the size of the class is a scandalous thing. You know, I really think the competitive aspect of school, this ranking and rating, it's awful. So it's not only the amount and the cost of education, but the style of education needs some deep thought. And again, it could, yeah.
I'd like to comment on Lee's notion of renationalisation. The question is simply, do we agree with that notion of the Commonwealth needing to be resurrected, taking the future back again?
Who wouldn't like a Commonwealth? About 0.5% of 0.5% of 0.5% of the world's population.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. One that I'd like to see brought back is the Public Works Department. We lost the Public Works Department totally, and they used to have hundreds of apprentices, learning a whole range of skills, moving out into the workforce, and also building up that corporate knowledge of how you build beautiful, wonderful schools in all over the place, hospitals, the wonderful big public buildings in the city. That's all gone now. And there's we lost Qantas, we lost the Commonwealth Bank. So I think your point's a really good one, and that's partly why we want to get this discussion going about renationalising and visioning that there is a necessity to have a whole lot of assets and services in public hands.
Otherwise, the ordinary workers are paying an enormous percentage of their income for these rentier capitalist charges. And people are going backwards and feeling very stressed out there.
Well, isn't the Business Council of Australia, the professional guilds, aren't they all unions, just pretending that they're not?
My friend.
Yeah, look, I'd probably have to get advice on that, how they define unions. So there certainly is truth in what you're saying, but what they're doing with legislation, increasingly in the federal parliament and to some extent in state, is that the legislation becomes minimal and they do more in regulations. So just to explain quickly, with regulations, governments can bring forward regulations and they don't go through Parliament unless you activate them, and all you can do is knock them out. So it's a sneaky way of governments being able to get forward their agenda with less scrutiny. So I think that's partly answers your question in terms of the abuse that goes on with regard to the legislative process. With regard to the unions in particular, there's there's 5 bills before Parliament at the moment that will heavily restrict how unions operate, not just with regard to mergers, but all these areas of compliance. It's just ballistic what they're doing.
And it of course relates to the domination of our media by who and a few of his cronies. I mean, as long as we don't have a free press, the ABC's been muzzled, it's very difficult to get a consciousness about what's happening to the unions.
And they've been defined as the other. You know, we who are nice people, we have individual bargaining, but they who have to work together. You know, so we really do need, you know, some free media. We need to, you know, really amp up our media presence.
Question here.
If the answer is against privatization, then who will have the power over the public goods that we depend on, right? And if it's the state, is the state really capable of organizing these public goods and reclaiming them again? Yeah. So how can we organize collective action on a systemic, structural way? How can we organize collective action with policymakers?
Really good question. It goes to the heart of the challenge that we face. I think it's worth remembering, Liz just mentioned about the Corbyn experience. Corbyn, the three things that he ran on was renationalising the railways, free higher education and workplace democracy. Obviously much more, but they were three key points. Labor in Great Britain now, I have to drop the great, Labor in Britain now has over 500,000 members. That's a social movement now. They're advocating for change. I think Labor, if Labor comes in, they couldn't not work on those sorts of positions. So social movements come in many forms, and we haven't had the strong, huge movements in this country for a long time. But I believe that it's a necessity. In many ways, the objective conditions will throw it up. When I was explaining that I've happened, you can say it's coincidence. There's 4 events on neoliberalism this week. In many ways, it's a response again to the objective conditions. The conditions being that people are agitated. They can feel something's wrong. They're looking for answers. So in many ways, we're at the foundation in terms of developing the movements and the form that will take. And I don't have the clear answer, and I imagine that's frustrating when you're sitting here listening to it. But history does show that when people get together and organise en masse, that the change does come. And to my mind, that is what we have to do, because the urgency is now extreme. It is really extreme. So collective organisation is what is needed.
And democratic.
Well, Bernie Sanders addressed the Get Up conference, and he just said that exactly those words, that change comes from below, young people are getting fed up, and there are things we've got to learn to be better meetings, as I mentioned, sociocracy, with interlocking circles of people listening to each other, then sending a representative to one circle, and then that representative's the next circle. So we coming downwards. Haven't got time, but I'm just saying is that we can organise better. We have to see common values, and already there's huge movements sweeping the world. In fact, not so long ago, Paul Hawken found that 1 billion people were trying to make a difference in various forms of social organisation. So it's big. I would say, and here I hope I'm being very ageist, that the young people need to get off their iPhones and go and talk to each other face to face and say, we want a future. And they can do it through the Greens Party, they can do it through Save Adani, they can do it through unions, but they need to get active. It's not going to just, well, say something. So yeah, I think young people have got to get really active, because their future is in doubt. And when I see people like Trump threatening North Korea, it's very scary, and you guys are going to have to step up. It is doable, and people have done it under much worse circumstances historically, in Serbia, in Russia, many places where deep oppression and you could be tortured. You know, we've got it pretty good.
Another question here, please.
My question's directed to Lee. Tonight you talked about a lot of things. Why didn't you talk about a jobs guarantee? Which I noticed, I happened to be reading Hansard recently over the business with One Nation and the overseas students taking Australian jobs, and you said some very good things, but didn't challenge that whole notion about where jobs come from. And although you've alluded to it tonight, why didn't you say that the federal government, you are I don't know who I want to vote for at present. That's how bad it is, and that's not me. But why didn't you say that ever since the Australian currency was floated, governments are not constrained by how much money they have to spend, and when the economy is flagging, it's the private sector is not spending, so why the hell isn't the government sector spending, and why don't you stand up and say, this is what we're going to fight for, like Corbyn did when he got rid of the third way labour rights, which I think they were all bastardised in Australia, actually.
Thank you. Look, I think I take your point. Look, there's a number of things that I didn't cover, and the issue of the government, the spending, the whole issue of the debt, carry on. There's a real need for the government to be borrowing more money. That's how we can, all those issues that we're talking about with regard to housing, to education, the health system.
They don't have to borrow, they can create credit. It's the private sector who shouldn't be creating credit.
But there is a need still to borrow money, and because of the low interest that's available, to governments, that there is nothing wrong with doing that. But there's nothing wrong with debt, and I didn't go into all those financial aspects to it. But when you say that you're not sure who to vote for, I mean, I think that they're like, none of our parties are perfect, and there's no one perfect party line, I acknowledge that. But the Turnbull government is purely on the planet to help corporations make money. I mean, that's why I've been talking about all that anti-union legislation. I mean, their constituency is corporate Australia. Corporations are on this planet to make profits. That's what they have to do. And that's why you have the anti-union legislation. That's why he's been muzzled about clean energy, etc. Because those mining interests still have a lot of power in terms of how they go about things. So I think that that's very real. I felt that the jobs issue was covered. If I didn't cover it exactly in the way that you framed it, I'll certainly take that on board.
Another question?
Well, can I say that one of the greatest generators of jobs is small business? We ask them to work crazy, we ask them to pay full taxes, but multinationals, well, they've got a big organisation and they don't pay very much tax at all. So I think when we promote small business, we're going to find much more jobs, much more training on the job. We're going to find much more satisfaction among middle-aged people and much more local flavour and colour instead of this sort of anodyne, everything looks the same, sort of Gold Coast look. Sorry to the Queenslanders. So I think the government giving jobs has a place, particularly under a depression situation, and yes, but I think what we can really encourage creativity and job creation by changing who pays tax, by encouraging innovation. Oh, there's a Turnbullism that we didn't see. You know, we can actually make lots and lots of jobs, and as I said, we can share the work and share the leisure and work 3 days a week, and that alone, with less costs to workers, will mean that everybody can be contributing and feeling proud of themselves and having enough time to care for the planet and themselves and their family.
We're already one of the most part-time nations in the world.
Great, that's a good thing. So we don't need a jobs guarantee, but we definitely need not to leave people behind and have people just rotting on the unemployment benefits, and we need to promote small business. And we can, you know, there's certainly things like the Snowy scheme or, you know, whatever, those sort of things. Like John F. Kennedy, he brought in the tax, what was it called, where you get money, a tax rebate for putting money into investment that would lead to working. So we could do things like that. So we don't have to push it through the government system entirely. We can have a mix of private and public, but we can't have the domination of, you know, 50 corporations.
Next question, please.
Liz, and if you look at today's online journal Counterpunch, which looks at British Ministry of Defence assessments of the risk of nuclear war out to 2035, it makes my knees tremble just to think about it. And the fact is, we have a psychiatrically certifiable President Trump who has the ultimate power to press the button in the so-called football which contains the nuclear codes. So is it not a form, to use a metaphor, all this talk about nationalisation and other good things is a form of skating on extremely thin ice.
The military-industrial complex, which I did allude to, the fact that people profit out of war or any weapons creation has to probably go. And you'll find when economies and groupings are more localised, most ordinary people do not want war. It is people who profit from it that push it, and along with their friends Murdoch and other those sort of people, this jingoism, disgusting. And this Korean thing is very disturbing. It's like the only thing America knows how to do is put more money into the military. Is that how they're going to employ us?
Lee, you mentioned that everyone has a caring component. Have you seen that in Peter Dutton?
So you're spot on. You can't find a caring, selling man. And as we speak, there's 400 men still in that part of Manus Island, and they've been very resourceful. They're able to get food and a little bit of water in, but the army went in and actually drilled holes in the water containers. So the threat of disease and the hardship is extreme. But a number of those men said under no circumstances will they leave a detention centre, that they would prefer to die there rather than leave. So for it to get to this point, you'd have to say is one of the most shameful periods in this country's history.
Speaking as a doctor, 2% of people are psychopaths. That means they can't feel each other's pain. About another 5% are pack followers, and they like to be in the gang near the tough guy. Now that's 7%, and that's enough with a few guns and a bit of, bravado to do what has happened in Germany recently, where 12 or 13% of the vote went to the overtly fascist party. So yes, war is a terrible problem, and that sort of psychopathy thing is something we must get more aware. And I go back to the thing about meetings. We all have to recognise that sort of behaviour and learn to handle it, because it is a real problem.
So ladies, let's just have one positive comment from both of you to end on. Just a positive note.
We can afford a better future.
It is about social movements. Human beings are a collective animal, and collectively we can bring good change.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much indeed, ladies. I think it was really stimulating and quite unusual for us to have two women talking together. I really liked the interaction there, and it was wonderful. Thank you so much.